Hey everyone, so as promised today I have an update to the endgame analysis tiering spreadsheet. Before the day one we made a similar video to this one going over all the new seasonal weapons, seeing if they were any good for the day one. That one was a bit rough around the edges, so I want to take this opportunity to update that spreadsheet and talk about the meta at a much more comprehensive bird's eye scale. We're going to be going over the new dungeon weapons as well from Sundered Doctrine. I know a lot of you guys have been asking for my opinions on that, so I'm excited to talk about that as well. So if it's not clear, we're going to be going over, the shopping list, the special, power, and primary tier list, etc. Moving on to origin traits, perks, fragments, and aspects last. I'm also going to skip over the archetypes, experimental, exotic armor builds, etc. those tabs because they require a lot more research and in-depth subject matter than I'm willing to talk about for the scale of this video. This video is already going to be long enough as is. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start by talking about the changes to the shopping list. Now, for those of you that are not aware, the shopping list is basically like a guide for newish players trying to get into endgame content. What should you grind for first if your aim is to do this content? Well, we have some answers here. Some of these have shifted around, new weapons, new roles, new meta shifts. We're going to talk about just the ones that I think are significant, okay? So number one, you'll notice here, right off the bat, first row, rockets have replaced heavy GLs as the burst damage / one phase scenario heavy weapon of choice. And that's because number one, we've gotten one of the best rockets in the game's history pretty much, Hesitant Vengeance with Envious Bait or Honing. And we've also lost 10% from our GL DPS, as well as lost some reserves from the rapid fire archetype as well, which has shifted them down to the medium priority section over the high priority section that they once were in. Number two, Queenbreaker has replaced Whisper of the Worm as the exotic total heavy damage choice, okay? And the reason for that is because Queenbreaker and Whisper have essentially similar total damage. Queenbreaker has higher DPS and it's easier to use than Whisper, because Whisper has a much more strict precision requirement. If you miss a crit, it's a huge punishment in terms of total damage, as well as needing to manually reload. So Queenbreaker is a lot better in this regard, and it doesn't really have any heavy reliance on reserve mods, much like Whisper, so it's very relevant for stuff like a day one, which you saw it in this past day one perform very well. We also have our classic backups of Grand Overture, Acreus, and Anarchy, and you'll notice Whisper is not even here, and that's because I think Queenbreaker has kind of like completely replaced the Whisper role for the most part. The support auto rifle I think was a bit underrated before, which I don't even know how that's possible because I've been singing this thing's praises since day one. But yeah, support autos, they have demonstrated that they're very, very strong in the past couple contest / underlight activities that we've gotten. And of course, we have the new one, Adamantite, which I had to include as an alternative to No Hesitation in the other slot, the kinetic slot. Okay, number four. The best in slot energy primaries have shifted in the Void 3.0 direction, talking about stuff like Repulsor destabilizing on Word of Crota, which I think generally speaking, Word of Crota strikes the best balance as an energy primary that has survivability, it has ad clear, it has a great origin trait, and if you can get used to the recoil, 180 RPM hand cannons have great minor DPS and great elite DPS. So pretty solid stuff from Word of Crota, and that's why I've shifted Heliocentric out of the top slot here and replaced it with Word of Crota. Exotic primaries in general have taken a bit of a backseat this season, and that's mostly because we're in a meta right now where in contest content, underlight content, endgame content, generally speaking, you're either taking an exotic heavy, which has a lot of total damage like Queenbreaker or something like a Thunderlord, or you're using an exotic special like Choir, or you're using like double special, so there's no room in your loadout for using something like Sunshot. So as a result, exotic energy primaries, nothing has really changed about them. I mean, I guess Graviton got a slight nerf, but the sandbox has shifted around them and has made them less of a high priority and more of a medium priority. Still very useful in some content, to be sure, very good for making finder bricks. But besides that, not as useful as some of the stuff in the high tier, in my opinion, this season. Okay. And finally, the last two, these are weapon specific. Praedyth has obviously replaced Supremacy as the best kinetic damage sniper, better perks in both columns pretty much. And then number two, Unloved has replaced Warden's Law as the kinetic Lucky Pants hand cannon of choice because it has elemental honing, whereas Warden's Law has Vorpal. Obviously, still they serve pretty much the same function, and Lucky Pants hand cannons are, I would say, not in the best spot right now, but still worth mentioning that Unloved is better than Warden's Law. Moving on, next up we have our special weapons. I'm just going to breeze through these tier lists and talk about what is happening at the top of the tier list, the best things in the meta that have changed as a result of this season. So first up, we have shotguns. Now you might notice unvoiced here is now in the S tier. I initially added it to the A tier, but after a closer look at buffed redirection, I strongly believe that this is more relevant than something like an Ikelos SG after the 1-2 punch nerfs, and Until Its Return, given that Until Its Return is kind of niche to begin with. Now the thing with buffed redirection is that it now gets up to 30 stacks, consuming 2 stacks when enhanced per every shot that you consume in order to make that shot a 2 times damage shot. And this is the first time in Destiny's history where we've had a 2 times damage perk in the first column, and then a regular damage perk like Bait and Switch 1.3 times in the second column, which makes for a crazy double damage perk combo. And redirection, since 30 divided by 2 is 15, you can have up to 15 double damage shots using this method. So the math doesn't lie. Unvoiced seems to be pretty good mathematically speaking. I'm still going to have to test this role in the future in actual content, in actual DPS. But at least as far as I know right now, it seems to be more viable than anything below it, in my opinion. Okay, so we'll see how good it is for damage. Maybe I'll use it for like a double slug rotation. The jury is still out on that one, but for now, I'm going to put it in the S tier just below Perfect Paradox. Snipers, not much changed here. I mean, Praedyth has replaced Supremacy. That's pretty much it. Okay, so that's all I have to say for snipers. For fusions, no major changes here. I mean, we have stuff like Afterlight, but nothing in the top tier has really changed. It's still Scatter Signal Zealots for the best rapids in either slot. Okay, we have Breach GLs. Psychopomp has been placed in the S tier because it is an area denial. It's maybe one of the less important area denials. Lost Signal, obviously very good for darkness building, the more annoying energy type to build on Prismatic. You have Baton, which has absolutely insane perks. And then, of course, you have Psychopomp. Psychopomp has Envious Arsenal. That's what makes it stick out to me, at least. And so it's technically good for, I guess, DPS rotations if you're the only one using an area denial. But I think in team settings, obviously, the fact that, multiple area denials don't stack make it so Envious Arsenal is a little bit less appealing. And then the other perks are obviously, no jolting feedback like I was hoping for, no attrition orbs or anything like that. So not as viable as Baton, but still definitely worth a shout thanks to having Envious. Next up, we have Glaives. Glaives, not much to mention here outside of the fact that someone told me that jolting feedback, even when enhanced on Glaives, requires 4 hits to trigger, which is pretty bad. So I've replaced it with Volt Shot on Backfang in particular, but the rest of this tier list looks pretty much the same. Glaives obviously got like a QOL buff, but that doesn't change any of the Glaive placements in the Glaive tier list. Next up, we have Traces. So a little bit of a spoiler here, don't look at your screen. There is a new trace coming out with the next upcoming event. I think it's like Guardian Games or something. With the next event, it's called Caraunios. And this trace is an arc adaptive trace. It has Discord and Recycled Energy in the first column. I'm curious to see if Discord refunds just 1 ammo on a trace. That would make it a little bit disappointing maybe. And then it has Detonator Beam, Jolting Feedback, and Rolling Storm in the second column. This is essentially Warlord's Spear with like maybe a better origin trait and like Discord, I guess. So potentially maybe interesting. Obviously the lack of shoot to loot prevents it from being in the S tier, but pretty good, pretty decent nonetheless. I wouldn't say like an insanely important grind or anything, but it's a thing that's coming out. Okay. Next up, we have Unsworn, one of the new dungeon weapons here. I will say that despite the fact that this weapon is strand and lacks a good splash perk, obviously hatchling is way worse than something like destabilizing or incandescent. The fact that this thing has subjugation makes it hit like a truck. And I'll explain why in like when we get to the primaries that have subjugation, but basically this thing has inbuilt explosive payload. It, flinches and staggers enemies, and also its damage profile in general, even when you don't have a good splash perk, still feels very strong. It just feels like it's buffed over other traces. So as a result, obviously this thing is the only shoot to loot kinetic trace, which probably would have been enough to put it in S to begin with, but subjugation just makes it feel really good, like it has a perk, like a third perk, I guess. But obviously shoot to loot detonator beam, everyone's going for that. But again, the fact that subjugation is so good, honestly, don't fret too much if you don't get detonator beam. Shoot to loot elemental honing or hatchling will still feel just fine with this trace, given that it has subjugation. I think it's just a really strong origin trait. Okay, next up we have Rocket Sidearms. Rocket Sidearms, I mean, Lotus Eater is an S. It's a Void's Rocket Sidearm with, Void perks, Repulse or Destabilizing. Not much to say here. I mean, obviously the origin trait is not amazing, but, it is a Rocket Sidearm, a very potent endgame special weapon archetype, and it has, like, the best Void perks for splash and survivability that we're all looking for all the time on all these new weapons. Obviously, the only thing holding this thing back is kind of ammo reserves compared to something like a Grid Skipper, right? But, it's still pretty good, and that's why I've decided to put it in the S tier. Okay, next up we have LMGs. Now, LMGs, nothing too crazy, right? Corrective is now an aggressive. You know, it's still pretty good, still S tier, you know, destabilizing, one for all, destabilizing KT, Firefly, one for all, etc., etc. You know, it's still pretty good, right? Nothing too crazy. I kind of wish Demo was maybe swapped into the second column, or maybe Firefly was moved into the right column. You know, destabilizing Firefly would be pretty crazy. But still, regardless, it's still an S tier machine gun. It's going to stay there. Watchful Eye, we talked about this last time. Overflow jolting feedback, you know, field prep jolting feedback, overflow tally, you know, the classic delirium roll. Just a good weapon. You know, aggressive frames are one of the best machine gun archetypes. And yeah, just pretty solid stuff from Watchful Eye. Nothing much to say there. Next up, we have heavy GLs. No major changes here. I've updated the reserve values with the help of my friend Spider. But besides that, you know, no major changes here. No new heavy GLs, no specific heavy GL nerfs or anything for, you know, one specific role or anything like that. So the tiers are staying the same. We have swords. Now, I talked about Abyssal Edge in the last video, and someone mentioned that I didn't talk about redirection. The problem with redirection on Abyssal Edge is that all the Pack Hunter projectiles consume redirection stacks. And so because you lose redirection stacks so quickly, it's not as viable for damage. Now, I could see this maybe being used in a dungeon speedrun or something like that, where you're only maybe doing like 5 or 6 combos where a dungeon boss dies, and redirection is 100% buff, and maybe you don't have Pack Hunter while you're doing that. So it could be potentially a good burst damage option. Maybe I'll add it to the swap tab or something like that in my spreadsheet. But for now, redirection is just kind of meh, I think, because of how fast it's consumed. You're trying to be optimal by using 100% damage perk, but then you're also losing that damage very quickly because of Pack Hunter also being an optimal decision. And as for the rest of the perks, obviously they're too situational, I would say. To be in the S tier, you don't have the inflated impact of a big quest, and you don't have the versatility of like a Summon Bonum, right? So yeah, that's it for swords. Next up, we have rockets. I mean, not much to say here. Hesitant Vengeance and Cynosure easily in the S tier. Not to spoil anything from the next artifact changes, but I believe we're getting something called like Strand Compounding or something similar to Arc Compounding for Strand. So Cynosure could potentially be very good there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The A tier, I've split it into like the A and B tier. It required a bit more segmenting. Didn't really make sense to have Tomorrow's Answer and Apex in the same tier as something like a Semio and a Blowout. So I put the good DPS rockets, or formerly good DPS rockets, I should say, in the A tier here, and I moved everything down a tier that's below it. And finally, our last heavy weapon type is linear fusions. We got Eyes unveiled this season, but it's pretty mediocre. Nothing at the top of the tier list has really changed, so I'm going to move on and not dawdle for too long talking about linears. Next up, we have primaries. Now, primaries, a couple changes here, but not too much. Autos, obviously Adamantite is very good. I don't think it's maybe deserving of being in the S tier with no hesitation. I still think Physic is incredibly valuable, and Incandescent is a better ad clear perk than anything Adamantite has access to, but Adamantite is still obviously very strong, and it's obviously the only support auto rifle in its slot, so maybe, you know, you could argue that it's deserving of S tier, but yeah, both of them have Attrition Orbs, which procs on healing allies, if you guys are not aware, which is why I think Recip and Attrition Orbs is the best roll on Adamantite. So yeah, pretty good stuff from these guys. I mean, the rest of the autos are pretty predictable, what you'd expect to be in the A tier. Next up, we have bows. Bows, yeah, non-denouement and Accrued Redemption are taking the top 2 slots. Non-denouement because it has double kind of splash/damage perks in Dragonfly Volt Shot, as well as being a solid archetype for one-shotting red bars. Accrued Redemption, obviously, with its bow scaler on Kinetic Tremors, does a lot of damage for just hitting an enemy twice, and obviously has access to the classic Archer's Tempo as well. Next up, we have hand cannons. In hand cannons, I want to talk about Unloved. You guys are probably already aware of the top 3 S tier choices and why they're there. I want to talk about Unloved real quick. I do think Unloved, I mean, Destiny primaries have been moving away from a single target model and more towards a splash damage model, aka this, and this. And Unloved is not really a splash damage hand cannon. It's got Dragonfly, which is like, you know, it's alright splash, but it's nothing like a destabilizing, right? And that's partially a function of being a strand weapon, meaning it doesn't really have access to very strong splash ad clear perks. But I do think the combination of Subjugation, the heavy burst hand cannon frame, and stuff like, you know, Dragonfly Frenzy makes this thing the best single target hand cannon in the game. So if you're looking for a hand cannon that has that classic Destiny feel without feeling like it's loaded with 3.0 verbs, I do think Unloved captures that classic Fatebringer feel of just being a hand cannon that really hits like a truck when it comes to dealing with individual red bars. If you're the type of player that likes primary gameplay, I do think Unloved is a really good weapon for you. just from a feeling perspective. But obviously its raw potency and its actual ad clear potential is nowhere near, a Word of Crota or a Posterity, which now gets redirection, by the way. If you don't mind, maybe running a loader mod or two and dealing with the slower reload of not having Frenzy, Voltshot redirection could potentially be a really good role to have on Posterity when dealing with orange bars. So yeah, just a little shout out there. I think this is like the other weapon where redirection is potentially useful. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much it for hand cannons. Let's move on to pulses. Pulses here, I mean, nothing new really. I guess like Joxers is kind of new, but yeah, I mean, top 6 options are just dominated by what you would expect: heavy burst, rapid fire, pulses. This one's only here because it has jolting feedback, and then of course repulsor destabilizing, dominating the top 3 slots with rapids and heavy bursts. I mean, kind of is what it is. It's just kind of how the meta is right now. Obviously, pulse rifles are very suited to kind of sitting back and getting repulsor and destabilizing procs non-stop. Very safe option for hard content. Next up, we have scout rifles. Unworthy, which is the scout rifle from Sundered Doctrine, is easily the best scout rifle in the game right now. It's not even close. This thing has Firefly Voltshot, which is a very, very potent combination, as well as Subjugation, arguably the best primary origin trait we've ever received, maybe outside of something like Cursed Thrall. So really, really strong stuff here. Obviously, it's a rapid fire frame as well, which makes it the best archetype scout. So pretty good stuff from Unworthy. Obviously, scouts are not amazing in the meta right now, and not many people use them for endgame content, but if you're a scout guy, Unworthy is probably the best one in the game right now. And finally, we have our last 2 primary weapon families. First, we have sidearms. Sidearms, not much has changed here, nothing crazy. I talked about Division already in the last video. If you can get over how the recoil feels on this thing, similar to a 180 RPM hand cannon, it's an absolute beast. It has a repulsor, destabilizing, and Dark Aether Reaper is obviously great on primaries as well. As for the rest of the primaries here, pretty predictable perk options, nothing too much to say here. Let's move on to SMGs. SMGs, you might be surprised to see 2 relatively old-ish SMGs in the top tiers here. Obviously, when we come to stuff like autos, bows, hand cannons, pulses, all of these have new options at the top of the tier list. SMGs, we're throwing it back to throwing it back, I guess, 1 year, to Recluse and Tidal, which both have repulsor and destabilizing, with Recluse having the better origin trait as well as frame compared to the Tidal, which is why it's rank 1. Obviously, stuff like Imminence and Multi-Mock are very useful in potentially contest content. They have very high utility, but Recluse and Tidal have much better ad clear just on their own with their raw perk power. Next up, we have the exotic weapon tier list, which I've completely redone from top to bottom. So I'm not going to go over every single change because that would take absolutely forever. And I've also decreased the amount of tiers by 1. We're only going from S to F tier, no more G tier. And I'm just going to go over the hits, right? The most important stuff, as well as talk about the 3 new exotics that have been introduced this season. Starting off at the top of the list here, we have Choir of One. Now, this thing is the most powerful multi-tool weapon we've ever received in Destiny. Does great boss damage, does great major burst, does great ad clear regardless of whether you take destabilizing or not. It's obviously very strong with a destabilizing buff as well. And the modified Radiolaria transposer you get for free from its command frame is something worth shouting out as well. So Choir of One, it's kind of excellent in any endgame content you can take it into, but the only restriction that it has is being exotic, really. So if you need an exotic heavy, obviously you can't run Choir. Okay. The A tier has shrunk significantly. It's only 4 options this season. Last time around, there were quite a few weapons in the A tier. I just wanted to shrink it to make it a bit more precise. You'll also notice that there's no G tier anymore. We've kind of compressed the tier list and made the bottom tiers a bit fatter. And so shrinking the A tier has kind of helped contribute to that. I wanted to highlight the weapons that are really strong almost universally, whereas the B tier is maybe weapons that are a little bit more situational that I've taken down from the A tier. Okay. Now let's talk about the B tier next. First up, we have Sunshot. Now Sunshot, like we talked about, exotic primaries are kind of taking a bit of a backseat compared to previous seasons, mostly because we are in a meta where a lot of people in endgame, contest, underlight, whatever it is content, are taking exotic heavy weapons like Queenbreaker, and so there's no room in your loadout for something like Sunshot. And in encounters where you're not taking Queenbreaker, you might be on something like Choir of One instead. And so Sunshot is not fundamentally like a bad weapon or anything, it's just that the meta has shifted around it like we talked about when we were talking about the shopping list. Okay, Queenbreaker, same thing, we were talking about this in the shopping list too. It has excellent total damage and DPS even without the artifact. A lot of people are saying this weapon is carried by particle or carried by the artifact right now. And while that is, to some degree true because of like the div stacking bug and everything, it's still an excellent weapon when you look at it outside of the artifact as well. Now the next one might come as a bit of a surprise to you. Thunderlord is now in the 3rd highest tier on this tier list. Bit of a glow up. I mean, Thunderlord used to be pretty low on this tier list for those of you that remember the early versions of this tier list, but I've come to respect this weapon as a result of the updates that it's received. So a couple things, right? Number one, Thunderlord obviously now produces Bolt Charge, right? And synergizes well with stuff like Storm's Keep. But number two, Thunderlord, for whatever reason with its change recently, no longer requires Actium to essentially fire indefinitely. For whatever reason, maybe like the Bolt Charge triggers on it are triggering like the Lightning Strike reload that it has. And so Thunderlord on any class, you can basically dump its entire reserves without needing any sort of loading assistance, which makes it way, way, way easier to use in endgame content, in my opinion. And obviously, while it's not as ranged as something like a Queenbreaker, not as precise, I still think it's endgame viable. It has competitive total damage, decent DPS, and excellent synergy with some of the meta stuff we have right now, like Storm's Keep. Okay, so that's it for the B tier. Let's go ahead and talk about the stuff that I've changed in the C tier. Alethanum no longer works on immune targets, which has cut into its viability a fair amount. Obviously, it's still quite unique in generating ammo as a weapon, something that no other weapon is able to do. And on top of that, it is still used for movement. I don't think Alethanum was in the B tier last season, but I just wanted to talk about the fact that the immune stacking no longer works, in case you guys are not aware. Next up, we have Bad Juju. I think I underrated this thing's super regen potential as well as its splash damage. While it's obviously not as good as something like a Necro or an Outbreak in terms of raw utility or raw splash damage, it strikes a good balance and is honestly not a terrible primary, and it is actually used in speedrunning. By the way, I have not updated these kind of icons that represent how good something is in different content this season, which is why, for example, Queenbreaker's in the B tier despite having all X's. So don't pay attention to these symbols yet. I'll update them at some point, but for now, don't look at them too much. Just focus on the tiers. Okay, so that's it for Bad Juju. Darcy is tentatively being placed in C. Even if Darcy's damage rotations with other snipers end up being pretty terrible, this is still a pretty decent damage option for less total damage focused, higher burst damage scenarios. And so Darcy just on its own is going to be in the C tier. Once we account for its effect and maybe do some damage rotation testing, I could easily see this being moved into the B tier with something like a Galley. But for now, I'm going to leave Darcy in the C tier because we're not sure as of now just how strong it is. Damage testing will be done in the near future though. Next up, we have Finality's Augur, the new dungeon exotic. Now my thoughts on this after doing some more research and testing with this weapon is it's basically a lazier anarchy that does more damage and is lower maintenance, but has less utility. So what do I mean by that? Well, Finality's Augur in its turret mode, if you don't use the linear mode at all, it has higher total damage than Anarchy and does higher sustained DPS than Anarchy, and the turret lasts 25 seconds, unlike Anarchy's traps, which last 10 seconds once they're activated. Which means basically you can pre-shoot a turret with this thing, mark a boss, and then do like special weapon damage, and then maybe, depending on the boss duration, you know, you may only need to have one more turret, right? If it's anything shorter than like a Vesper's boss phase, then you can just have another turret go down, and 50 seconds, that's more than enough for most phases in the game. So it's very low maintenance, very low effort compared to Anarchy, but obviously, unlike Anarchy, you can't use it in like speedrunning to trap like 6 different doors. And so, you know, they both have their own uses. I do think Augur will end up being the better choice for damage overall, and obviously in something like a day one, only needing to use 1 mag of linear ammo for an entire damage phase, if you're relying a lot on special weapon DPS, is a pretty solid thing to have. So I'm just going to put this thing in the C tier for now. Now again, these damage numbers that I'm citing, as in like being better than Anarchy, rely on bait and switch being the catalyst, right? So obviously, you know, a lot of people have been asking me with my finalities numbers, you know, if bait and switch was included in that testing. It is included, even though it's technically doesn't exist. I can just multiply the numbers by 1.3, and that's what I did. So even with bait and switch, this thing is not particularly amazing, but I'm excited to test some like damage rotations with Darcy snipers and finalities ticking in the background using its turret. Okay, next up we have Forerunner. I think I underrated the fragmentation grenade that Forerunner creates. It does a lot more damage than I expected. This weapon also did not get hit by like the special sidearm nerf done to rocket sidearms, so this thing still gets like 87 ammo, which is absolutely insane. And I can definitely see this actually being used in maybe some speedruns where you want an ammo efficient just explosion to clear a room where you don't have access to something like a rocket. And the fact that it only requires 1 kill and then 4 ammo is very, very convenient, to be honest, as well. I can see this being used in like a raid speedrun in some cases, maybe to clear a room of ads in like Shuro or something. So yeah, pretty cool stuff from Forerunner. I think I underrated it in the past, and so I'm just giving it its flowers now in the C tier. Our last two options in the C tier that I want to talk about are the Navigator and Winterbite. Now the Navigator is ranked a little lower than it was last season, mostly because grapple meleeing is mostly out of the meta now, thanks to the Stealth 1-2 punch nerf. Obviously you can still do grapple melee damage, and it's still relevant maybe on some bosses for some solo dungeon stuff, maybe for speedruns, but for the most part, you know, Without the grapple point creation on the catalyst, the rest of this gun is not particularly amazing. Obviously, giving your teammates woven mail is fine and all, but you know, support auto rifle kind of does the same job as navigator. Sever is already done by like Facet of Solitude or like a slice weapon. So this weapon is, you know, it doesn't do that much outside of creating the grapple point that a support auto doesn't already kind of do 75 to 80% of, right? So that's kind of why navigator is in the C tier, and I would argue support auto is like a lot easier to use as well. It does not require direct hits or anything like that. Okay, next up we have Winterbite. So Winterbite, obviously ignore all the X's here, massively improves viability thanks to all the glaive melee buffs we've received season over season over season. It's now in a place where even without the Nobel artifact mod, obviously artifact does not affect my tier list, it's a decent sustained weapon, right? It's a decent sustained damage weapon, requires no ammo whatsoever, and pretty easy to use, might I add, compared to some of the other weapons that, you know, require you to hit crits or do a damage rotation or anything. So Winterbite is potentially a pretty decent damage option in terms of being a sustained damage option, and that's why it's in the C tier. Next up, we have the D tier. Barodiad, new SMG. I've run some tests on this thing. This is the most question mark exotic that I've seen this season. So I'm very excited to see what will happen when it gets like blighted target lock. I'm going to test it with Peacekeepers. It could potentially be the new best, you know, primary DPS in the game. But again, we're waiting on the kind of verdict to come out on that because it's currently a time-gated, you know, quest exotic. So we're waiting on some of the newer stuff to come out before I want to give this a solid review. For now, I'm going to put in the D tier because its ad clear is actually fairly decent. One of the better exotic ad clear SMGs, and we've been needing one of those, so I'm happy that we have one now. Delicate Tomb has received a bit of a glow up and now receives a 2x damage increase on Ionic Trace pickup, which is obviously great for Major Shred and has strong synergy and Major Melt with stuff like Geomags this season if you're willing to stomach an exotic special fusion rifle and its ammo economy. So if you're willing to deal with that, it's pretty decent, can go in the D tier. Same thing with Cold Heart. Next up, we have Dragon's Breath, which I think was a bit overrated last season. Given the amount of effort and the amount of time it takes for this thing to load and shoot, I do think it is not deserving of being in the C tier. The total damage and DPS of this weapon is actually quite disappointing compared to most of the other, you know, similar weapons in this list that don't require you to run kind of like Solar and Ignite a boss repeatedly to make optimal use of this weapon. Next up, we have Icebreaker. Now, Icebreaker is primarily used in endgame content in damage rotations or for generating ammo. And the ammo generation thing hasn't really changed that much, but Bungie is continuously releasing better and better envious specials or swap DPS specials like Keen Thistle and Unvoiced, which are kind of eclipsing the role of Icebreaker as this swap DPS king because of its slow fire rate but high damage per shot. And so Icebreaker, I think, you know, it's not really deserving of being in the C tier. I think D tier is a better placement for it, and that's why I've decided to leave it here. Lodestar is our final new exotic weapon this season. I think in a tier surrounded by Quicksilver Storm, Revision Zero, Red Death, Reformed, for example, it's right at home here. It's like a ranged option. It's decently strong on arc, pretty strong on arc, I would say. But the fact that it really only largely synergizes with one subclass makes it kind of restricting compared to some of the other good exotic primaries, for example, like Necrochasm, which is in the C tier, or for example, like an Outbreak, right? So yeah, that's why I've decided to put Lodestar in the D tier. Le Monarch is also temporarily in this tier to see if the Bolt Charge interaction stays with its Poison Linger. If it doesn't, we probably might move it into the E tier, but for now, Le Monarch can stay in the D tier. I'm going to do an entire video entirely dedicated to Bolt Charge testing with this bow as well as other weapons, so, you know, stay tuned for that, but for now, I'm going to leave it in the D tier just for its Bolt Charge interaction. Lord of Wolves is also going to make it into the D tier. It's a tentative placement here given the reserve buff. Obviously, I'm assuming here that Bungie accidentally buffed this thing by 2 times per burst. And so if they nerf it back to its original value, I think it's going to be somewhere around the D tier. It has actually fairly decent total damage for a melee range special weapon, and its DPS isn't terrible as well, even if they nerf the damage by 2 times. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about in the D tier is Vex Caliber. This thing is the strongest defensive glaive in the game by far. Unfortunately, it is still a glaive and it does still take your exotic slot, which is why I can't really put it much higher than D tier, but I do think it deserves a shout out for being the best defensive glaive in the game. Synergizes very well with the artifact, even though that's irrelevant for this list, just, you know, wanted to point that out. And finally, in the E tier, the last weapon I want to talk about is Prospector. Prospector took a big hit. Not only did it get reserve nerfed, not only did it get DPS nerfed, but also I think I overrated its consistency, and I did some retesting this season and it's much more disappointing than I remember it, and I don't think it's relevant for most bosses in general anymore, and so I decided to put it in the E tier with a lot of these other weapons that are just kind of better than their legendary equivalents in PvE, but there's no reason really to ever use them. Okay, so that's it for exotic weapons. Let's go ahead and move on to origin traits. Origin traits, we got 4 new origin traits this season, so I'm just gonna blaze through them. Subjugation, again, this thing is absolutely insane. If you guys are not aware of how this works, if you shoot a minor or elite, you have like explosive payload, and then if you shoot a mini boss or up, you get free exhaust on hit. Now, even one of these effects would be very useful. Both of them combined is pretty insane, and the fact that you can basically give explosive payload to like a slug or to like a trace makes this one of the best origin traits that we've ever received in the game. This is just a flat upgrade to like half the origin traits in the game that are damage based, so pretty insane stuff from this, easily an S tier pick for me. Next up, we have Time Lost Magazine. This is basically Restoration Ritual power creep. This is just better than Restoration Ritual in every way, right? It's not an emergency reload. You literally get a doubled mag for 20 seconds just for casting your super, which is insane, which is just insane. I don't think I really need to say much, right? So yeah, it's insane. Time Lost Magazine, it's OP. It's rank 3, it's in the S tier. Okay. Next up, we have Willing Vessel, which I've moved to the B tier. This is basically Bitter Spite, but like instead of receiving damage, you deal damage. I'm not sure how much reload it gives you. It's probably not going to be as much as Bitter Spite, but just based on the description alone, it seems like this is a decent neutral pick. Fits right well between Field Tested and Bitter Spite. You know, makes sense. Okay. Next up, we have Paracausal Fluid as the last new origin trait this season. Yeah, this is pretty bad. Yeah, this is basically like Hot Swap, but worse. That's my notes for it. Because upon dealing damage, you get some handling, right? Whereas Hot Swap, just swapping to the weapon after taking damage in general, when you need the handling, because you're swapping to the weapon, you basically have the 100% handling uptime as long as you swap off the weapon fast enough. Paracausal Fluid is, you know, it's not as good, right? It's just not as good, but they're similar in terms of what they do. They're both just kind of handling origin traits. They're just kind of okay stats, which is why they're both in the D tier. Finally, we have perks, and then we're going to talk about Storm's Keep, and then we're going to be done. Okay. So perks, this is a very big tier list. Okay. I moved a lot of stuff, but I will talk about the most important things, and then we're going to move on to abilities. So first things first, redirection got a huge buff, right? Redirection got a huge buff. Now all you need to know about redirection is that every time you shoot a red bar, for every shot that you land, it will store a shot that you can then use on an orange bar to get 2 times damage. And you can store up to 15 shots this way. So obviously really, really good on stuff like DPS specials, for example, on Unvoiced, the slug from Sundered Doctrine, or even on the demo redirection roll on New Pacific Epitaph, which is obviously really, really strong on a waveframe because you can hit multiple red bars with just 1 shot of waveframe and then dump that 2 times damage on something like an orange bar. So I'm excited to see what potential new weapon types Bungie might introduce this perk onto, because just on its own now, the ability to have 15 2 times damage shots on bulky targets now is absolutely insane. The only reason why this is not in the S tier is because it still requires some setup, and it doesn't have a fully realized, fully fleshed out identity on maybe some weapon types that might benefit from it even more than the weapons that currently have access to this perk. Next up, we have Repulsor Brace. Repulsor Brace, I low-key just forgot to move it after the Void Overshield buffs some seasons ago. And so this thing basically gives you 150 effective health when it triggers, because Void Overshield has a natural 70% DR, and you get 45 HP off of it, right? So this is obviously very easy to access now that Destabilizing Rounds has been buffed. Very, very easy to apply Volatile to a large group of enemies. Very, very easy to trigger this over and over. Obviously, it's not as cut and dry as something like Heal Clip, where one kill instantly just gives you healing. Repulsor requires you to kill debuff targets, but doesn't require a reload. But since it's a little more specific and a little bit more restrictive than something like Heal Clip, I've decided to put it in the B tier between stuff like Reciprocity and Withering Gaze, which I think is totally fair. Adaptive Munitions, I'm not sure if I've talked about this on video yet, but has been nerfed. Okay, at some point when Match Game was like gone from the game, they like nerfed this thing absolutely terribly. It scales now to 50%. This is the biggest nerf we've ever seen to a perk number-wise. Just as a reminder, Adaptive Munitions used to scale to 450% increased damage to unmatched or barrier shield damage. Now it scales to 50, which is a 9 times nerf, which is pretty crazy, pretty insane. Under Over is just better than this perk. It's just better than this perk. So yeah, Adaptive Munitions in the gutter, moves it from the E to the G tier. Next up, the new perks from the season. We're going to talk about them now. Elemental Honing is obviously in the S tier. I put it a little bit lower than Bait because it's a little bit more annoying to activate, obviously, but 20-second duration is insane. 40% on kinetics is insane. And the fact that you can set this up in like a speedrun environment or just like a controlled environment and just go absolutely ham with this damage perk for 20 seconds, which happens to be exactly how long Time Lost Magazine lasts, for example, makes it the best setup sustained DPS perk in the game, which is why it's in the S tier. Next up, we have Reciprocity, which you might have noticed I've also placed in the B tier. I think this is a little bit worse than Physic because Restoration on Physic doesn't require you to hold down the gun, just requires you to trigger the perk, whereas Reciprocity basically acts like Restoration, but you need to hold left click on your ally. So it's more on-demand healing right at the start, but obviously Physic is a little bit better once you actually trigger the Restoration, meaning you can swap off the weapon, which in my opinion is a little bit more convenient for a support auto than something like Reciprocity, which is why this is in the B tier. Next up, we have Detonator Beam in C. After some testing on this weapon, I believe it's something like a 25-ish% overall damage buff to a trace if you have sustained damage on a target. And it's good, right? I don't know if I would take it over something like destabilizing rounds, but it's pretty useful. And definitely if you're like a Cenotaph user, I can see this being a great perk in order to mark a target and also deal some chip damage to that target to help your teammates weaken it so that they can get the kill. So pretty useful stuff from Detonator Beam. Next up, we have Rolling Storm. I think Rolling Storm is quite overrated. It is somewhere in the D tier here. Yeah, it's somewhere near the bottom. Now, the thing about Rolling Storm is that Bull Charge, it's nice, and obviously it's very strong this season with the Artifact mod, but unlike an Ignition or like a Volatile Explosion, it has much lower like spreadability, I guess you can say, a much lower splash radius, and so the effect itself is not super strong. The benefit from Rolling Storm is that it doesn't have an internal timer, like an internal cooldown, so you can activate it as often as you can charge it, and it's on hit to charge it and not on kill. Rolling Storm changes this because it requires kills. The only thing that Rolling Storm does that's unique and actually beneficial is that in places where you can't get that initial Bolt Charge stack, Rolling Storm is the only weapon-based option that allows you to get Bolt Charge, right? Now the thing is, on builds that rely on making and stacking Bolt Charge, you already have sources that generally get Bolt Charge pretty easily, so Rolling Storm is kind of useless. And then when you're building the Bolt Charge itself, on hit is already fast enough to really charge Bolt Charge really quickly, so it's kind of a question mark on whether you would even want this perk on a weapon. It's kind of like a waste of a perk when you already have really good access to Bolt Charge, right? Whereas on builds where you don't have access to Bolt Charge and maybe you want Bolt Charge, it's not really worth kind of wasting a perk slot just to get that 1x stack most of the time. So it's all right. I think it's okay on stuff like Psychopomp, for example, but I don't think it's, as good as a lot of the other 3.0 perks like Incandescent and Destabilizing Rounds, which are much more just 1 kill equals splash damage, right? Whereas this is like 1 kill equals, okay, I'll kickstart an effect where on hit, eventually you get a Bolt Charge, right? Which an individual Bolt Charge is not super crazy. Now, if Rolling Storm increased the rate that a weapon passively got Bolt Charge, for example, like on an Area Denial, this would be a much better perk. But as it stands, it's on kill. Even if you double it with Amplified and Spark of Frequency, it's 4 stacks, but again, it's on kill, it's kind of whatever. I don't think it's that good in endgame content in particular. Obviously, if you put this on Psychopomp and you enhance it and you have Spark of Frequency, you will kind of get a crap load of Bolt Charge just by dealing with a bunch of like thralls or whatever, but I think in endgame content, it's not that great, especially on stuff like primaries like Palindrome, where it's a very slow tempo perk compared to the other perks that you would typically have, like, Destabilizing Rounds. Okay, next up we have both Demoralize and Tear in E. And the reason is, these are splash debuff effects. And generally speaking, like when you want to weaken a target or when you want to sever a target, it's a high health target like a boss or a champion or a mini boss that you can't deal with immediately, right? Generally speaking, you're basically wasting an entire perk slot on the off chance that you kill an enemy with a precision kill and that there's a nearby enemy that you happen to want to debuff because you can't deal with that enemy instantly. This is a very rare case, and this is not something that I would waste a perk slot on personally, and so that's why I've decided to place these in the E tier, where something like Destabilizing Rounds, ads tend to be surrounded by other ads, you kill an ad with Destabilizing, boom, suddenly you have a splash effect that is immediately obvious and immediately helpful. It doesn't make sense to sever or weaken nearby enemies when you can just kill them with the perk instead. Okay, next up we have Recycled Energy in the F tier. As far as I'm aware from the testing that people have sent to me, this is literally just worse than Wellspring Demo Pugilist Strategist, okay? And it requires a kill reload, so it's not good. It's not good. I don't know why they made this perk. It's not good. And finally, we have Melee Momentum, which is essentially, in my opinion, kind of like a movable object. I've been told it gives you almost like half your glaive energy for getting a glaive melee kill, which is fine and all. It'd be pretty useful if like Melee Momentum was on like Vex Caliber or something. That would be pretty nice. But on a special like legendary glaive, it's just okay. I think if you're getting up in there, with a special legendary glaive, especially with like glaive melee kills, I don't know, it's kind of a risky playstyle, especially in a lot of endgame content. But it's perhaps a niche option, like I've written here, for glaive melee centric builds, maybe using close to melee and like Devour and just like chaining melee kills with like a Triton Vice or something. Yeah, but besides that, again, it's not super relevant, very niche if it's relevant at all. And so I'm going to put it next to a movable object, which it reminds me of just basically, you know, perks that are going to give you more bang for your buck when it comes to killing or hitting enemies to get glaive energy. Okay, so that's pretty much it for perks. Finally, we're going to talk about aspects. Aspects, I haven't really changed my opinion on either Ionic Sentry or on the Prowl. They're both probably in the B tier, you know, not super amazing or anything. And then obviously Storm's Keep used to be in, I think, the A tier or maybe in the B tier. And I said that I would remove it once we got some more testing info on how good it actually is. And yeah, it's really good. Right, so it's obviously not going to beat stuff like, you know, Banner of War, Lethal Current, Feed the Void, but I've decided to place it in the S tier because it is excellent. It's just passive damage. Arc Titan is not terrible in terms of like the damage super that it has to offer for offering this kind of team-wide buff. You know, a lot of the time when you need to provide something to your entire team as a benefit, your subclass suffers, but you know, T-Crash on like Curus with, you know, Arc Titan is certainly not bad or anything, and the nades are pretty good damage as well. So yeah, Storm's Keep, very strong, good for passive damage. Not amazing, I guess, neutrally, but that's not really what you're looking for in this exotic anyway. So it's nice to see Titans getting like a supportive option. I don't think Titans have really had anything that is like meta that they use to support their teammates. You know, obviously Hunters have had like, I don't know, Invis, you can have like Tether, Warlocks obviously have Well. Titans have kind of just been like solo ad clear beasts using Consecration recently. So it's nice to see that now they have something that they can contribute to their team in terms of passive damage, just by giving them a Storm's Keep barricade. So pretty nice stuff. That is pretty much all I have to say in this video. Again, subclass tier list, exotic armor, archetypes. We're going to be working on this stuff throughout the season and updating it as we go. In the near future, I am currently working on completely redoing the archetype tier list with my own primary numbers as well. So I'm pretty excited to talk about that, as well as the experimental tab with maybe some new suggestions for the sandbox balancing team. But for now, that's all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it's not too long. And yeah, the next video will either be the prof breakdown or maybe some archetype analysis. So yeah, I'll see you guys later, and I hope you enjoyed.